I want to get rid of this I won't remember
I'd like to push it all.
How are you? Lovely to be here. Good to see you. Next time, yeah.
All right, we are going to get started, so folks can find their seats. There should be enough seats for everyone.
Not necessarily about that, which is nice. So. More into the topic itself.
All right, so welcome, right? The first order of business is welcome to Power at the Margins, mobilizing across housing injustice. And for those of you who have traveled from afar, welcome to the Twin Cities and the University of Minnesota. We are really, really happy to have all of you here. You have traveled from as close by as South Minneapolis, just a few miles away, and as far as Germany and Canada, and all up and down the West Coast, the East Coast, the South, and we are really grateful for your wisdom and your presence in this conference. So, what we're going to do really briefly is I'm just going to kind of say a couple opening words. We're going to bring up James DeSoto from the University Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center, UROC, which is where we are right here. And then we are going to introduce our awesome plenary speakers. I'm Eric Goldfischer. I'm a PhD student here in the Geography Department at the University of Minnesota. I'm one of the folks who have organized this conference along with Teresa Gowan, professor in sociology, who's over there, and Kaylin Oakes, who is an undergrad in the Geography Department, who's right outside the door there. So we called this conference because many of us in academia and in organizing work, we live our lives in this balance, right, in this weird limbo space between what is commonly called activism and what is commonly called scholarship, right? But for many of us working in that place, we know that there can't be such a distinction, right? It doesn't work, it doesn't hold up. Groups like Picture the Homeless in New York, folks from whom are here today, have shown that the expertise and knowledge of those marginalized from traditional housing, homeless folks, housing insecure folks, evicted folks, can quite literally change the look and the feel of life in the urban spaces, right? So, you know, Picture the Homeless as an example of this realized through their experiences years ago that the city of New York was holding vacant property that could be redeveloped for homeless folks for affordable housing, and they knew, they had the scholarship, they had the expertise, they had the knowledge to tell folks about this, right? And so folks in Minneapolis are starting to do this now with organizing for rent control, right? Folks on the ground here who know that living in a situation where your rent rises steadily every year and you have no control over it, right? They don't need to call the University of Minnesota to help them figure that out, right? They know it. And so they're starting to make these changes on the ground. And so we brought this together because we feel like within this room there's an incredible amount of power and knowledge and expertise, and we want to provide a space for us to learn from each other, and we want to do it in a way that's different than the traditional academic conference, right, where everyone's kind of siloed. We want to do it in a way where we're learning from each other and with each other, and so that's what we hope we can accomplish today and this weekend. So this conference has been several years in the making and would not have been possible without the shared support and ideas and dreams of probably most of the people in this room. We want to thank, in particular, the University of Minnesota Institute for Advanced Study for making this conference possible and for supporting our original idea. We want to thank the Imagine Fund of the University of Minnesota Provost, which gave us the money to help fly many of you out here today, right? And we want to thank the Geography Department, the Theater Department, and the Sociology Department for supporting us along the way as well. And finally, we want to thank UROC, the University Research and Outreach Engagement Center, where we are right now, for generously hosting this opening session. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up James DeSoto from the University Research Outreach Engagement Center to say a few words about the space we're in. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Minnesota. Thank you, Eric. My name is James DeSoto, and I'm Director of Administration and Projects here at the Robert J. Jones Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center, commonly known as UROC, because otherwise it's quite the mouthful. We do a lot of work here around engagement. As you can tell by our name, we have over 60 projects we're currently running. We work with over 100 different community partners and agencies here in primarily North Minneapolis, although we do work in St. Paul as well. We work in three main areas that have been co-identified with community: economic and community development, health and wellness, and education and lifelong learning. So all of our various projects fall into one of those three areas, and quite often multiple. My work primarily is around the Northside Job Creation Team. So we currently sit in North Minneapolis. It is the historic intersection of Penn and Plymouth Avenues, and has faced a lot of neglect over the years from policymakers, from government officials. And one of the things that happened when our most recent governor was elected is that he actually came here in this room and held a community meeting. And he asked the people in the room, what can I do? If I'm elected, what should I do? And people stood up and they said, well, if you want to actually help North Minneapolis, you need to start looking at job creation. And so out of that promise, thankfully, community members held the governor accountable. And through that, we created something called the Northside Job Creation Team. And our job was to create 1,000 living wage positions here in North Minneapolis that would go to Northside residents within 5 years. They needed to be sustainable jobs, living wage, with benefits. So we've spent, at this point, over 5 years working on that. And there's been, as a lot of you know, quite a few issues when it comes to land development, property issues, who holds that property, what it can be used for, combating gentrification, certainly. That's been one of the things that's been a huge issue here in North Minneapolis. Large developers who have been holding land and are waiting for transit lines to go through. And until they do, they're not going to move off that land. So very common issues that we all end up facing when we're trying to do work with our communities. So it's been frustrating in many ways, but at the same time, we actually have been able to reach that 1,000 job threshold. So A lot of our work here also has to do with human and sex trafficking. Our director of research does a ton of work in those areas. As many of you know, the Super Bowl was just here recently. So there was a lot of misinformation that was put out around the Super Bowl and how it's this huge, enormous increase in trafficking, when actually the baseline is so high that the Super Bowl and other large events, there is a slight uptick, but it's not as if it's not going on in the background anyway. Another big thing that a lot of people believe here in Minnesota, Minneapolis, is that it wasn't an issue. Human trafficking, sex trafficking, there wasn't really an issue going on here. One of the top 5 locations in the United States for trafficking is here in Minneapolis, which was shocking, especially to a lot of nice Midwesterners who, of course, don't think that happens here. So a lot of what we do is research community engagement to try and actually work with our communities so that we can explore different solutions to problems that we all face together. So it's transforming the way that we work with community, but maybe more importantly, transforming the way that we work with the University of Minnesota. So again, welcome. If you want more information about UROC, certainly we have plenty of that available. I hope that your conference goes well over the next several days. I know that they put a lot of time and effort into organizing this. And again, welcome to Minnesota.
All right, so we are going to get right into it with our opening plenary session. So the 5 folks who are about to come up here are, for me, some of the biggest influences on thinking about why we would have a Scholar Activist Conference and why this work is critical for folks working at that intersection of academic work and community organizing around housing justice. So we are going to, I'm going to introduce them, and then they're all. After losing his job in 2001, he spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City shelter. Since 2007, Rob has been a homeless and housing activist working with organizations across the US and around the world. And then we have Gretchen Purser. Gretchen is an assistant professor of sociology at Syracuse University at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She's also chair of the board of the Workers Center of Central New York. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Labor on Demand, Dispatching the Urban Poor from the University of California Press, and articles published in ethnography, qualitative sociology, critical sociology, and more. Her scholarship focuses on work, labor, and urban poverty in the United States. Then we're joined by Craig Willse. Craig is an associate professor of cultural studies at George Mason University. He is the author of The Value of Homelessness, Managing Surplus Life in the United States from the University of Minnesota Press. He is also co-editor of special issues of The Scholar and Feminist Online and Women in Performance, as well as Beyond Biopolitics, which is a collection of essays on the governance of life and death. And finally, we are joined by Nikita Price, who is the civil rights organizer at Picture the Homeless. In this campaign, he focuses on selective police enforcement and broken windows policing as it applies to the homeless and poor in New York City. Nikita joined Picture the Homeless in 2006 and has been with them as the civil rights organizer since 2014. He is presently raising 2 lovely daughters, Nanina and Naima, as a single father, and is passionate in his role of fatherhood and social justice organizing. Picture the Homeless presently has a major voice in one of New York's largest coalitions, Communities United for Police Reform, and sits on the Policy Working Group and Steering Committee. And finally, asking the questions and moderating this conversation, we have our very own Teresa Gowan. She teaches ethnography and urban sociology at the University of Minnesota. Since publishing her ethnography, Hobos, Hustlers, and Backsliders, Homeless in San Francisco, also from the University of Minnesota Press, she has developed her ongoing interest in neoliberal poverty policy into a comparative qualitative study of addiction treatment, focusing particularly on the uneasy convergence of punishment and the therapeutic court-mandated or strong-arm rehab. So please welcome our 5 plenary panelists.
So look, let's start with Rob. What we've done is try to figure out questions which will bring out like the diversity of strengths that these folks, you know, are bringing to our conference, and that we know is sort of proliferated around the rest of you. Is this thing still clicking weirdly? Okay. Yeah. I don't. Yeah. Okay. So with Rob. You know, we know that how much you've worked extensively across using human rights within academia, NGOs, and local grassroots organizing. So you've got like this really like very broad, multi-level kind of set of connections. And you know, we wanted you to kind of just say something briefly about, you know, how do you see this relationship between scholars and activists playing out in some of the stuff that you do?
So, thank you. And before I respond, I want to first thank the University of Minnesota. This is my second time here in about 6 months. I got to meet Teresa. Eric I've known for a number of years. When he was thinking about grad school, he sought me out, and I tried to steer him towards the City University of New York Graduate Center, which is a favorite institution of mine, but he ended up out here in Minnesota, but we still stayed in touch with one another. So I just want to thank Eric for bringing us out here, and I know the hard work that goes into putting something like this together. So props to you, brother, and your education out here. And I want to also say thank you to Teresa, who, on my first trip out here, gave me a wonderful book that I'm reading for the second time. Teresa wrote an incredible book called Hobos, Hustlers, and Backsliders, and it's a book that gives us an inside look at street homelessness. You heard from the introduction that I'm formerly homeless, so I know what that life is like. I have that lived experience. It is a wonderful dialogue of stories, or a gathering of stories of people living on the streets of San Francisco that I think is a must read for anybody who's experienced homelessness or thought about homelessness in any deep way. It's a dynamite book. And as I said, I'm reading it for the second time, so thank you. I think the question you raised is an interesting one to me. I'm a former member of Picture the Homeless. After I came out of homelessness, I joined the organization that you've heard a lot about already since you've been here. And I think it started for me in the shelter. When I arrived in the New York City shelter, I was starting to hear this phrase called gentrification. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew this phenomenon was taking hold in New York City at the time. And for me, I also saw a struggle of people in the shelter system trying to get housing. And it seemed to me, and it wasn't just a theory, it was happening this way, that it was people with a mental health diagnosis were the people that were being housed, and people that were considered general population, like myself, no diagnosis, you know, for whatever reason, we just had a hard time, right? We couldn't find housing. There was no affordable housing in New York City. And forget it, I was blessed to have an education and had a formal work history, but a lot of people that are stuck in that shelter system in New York didn't have that. So I would use my time in the shelter to go to the library and learn about gentrification, and I started to understand these challenges. And I was talking to the executive director from Picture the Homeless earlier today as we were talking, and I said, do you remember a conference that we were at Columbia University? It's the first time I'd ever talked publicly about these issues. I'd never done it before. Lynn and I were there representing Picture the Homeless, and on that panel, immediately to the right of me was Dr. Peter Marcuse, a professor emeritus from Columbia University. To his right was Brenda Stokely, a well-known municipal union worker and activist in New York City, one of the founders of the Million Workers March movement. And to her right was Ed Ott, and then he was the director of the Central Labor Council in New York, right? So these are powerful folks that were sitting up there with. I was sweating bullets, man. I'm telling you, I swear to God, I was sweating bullets at this particular time. But I did my talk and got a lot of applause, but there was somebody in the audience, I made a statement, and I made this phrase. I said, gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. And there was another distinguished professor sitting in the audience by the name of Neil Smith. And he stood up and said, say that again? Neil Smith was a geographer from New York City and at the CUNY Grad Center, and he said, say that again. And I made that statement again. Gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. And Neil said, I want to talk to you after this conference. And That was the beginning of a change in my life, or what I call transformation. I had never sought out academia. I was raised in middle-class surroundings, working-class family. I didn't do a lot of reading once I got out of school, but Neil forced that issue. Neil said to me something that resonated with me for the rest of my life. He said, my students can learn as much from you and people like you, Rob, who have lived experiences, as much as they can from somebody like me who has a document that officiates me somehow. So I want you to come up to the university and talk to my students. You talk to my class and share your experiences. But at the same time, I'm going to challenge you to take my students out into the community so they can touch and feel those experiences that you were sharing in this particular time. So it was the beginning of a relationship, and Neil had me read at a particular time when I wasn't interested in reading. He had me read some of his own books, and I'll give you two in particular that I wrote down here because it was a time when I wasn't thinking about reading. So one was Uneven Development, because I started to learn about gentrification, and the other one was Gentrification of the City. But he also shared a little story with me. He said, one of my mentors is also teaching at this university, Rob, and I want you to go meet Dr. David Harvey, right? But before you meet him, I want you to read two of his books. I know I'm giving you a lot of assignments, but I want you to just come back and when you read them at your pace, when you're ready to talk about them, you read them. That was Rebel Cities, and then he said, A Companion to Marx's Capital. Because one of the things that flipped me out, one of the things I kept saying is, I said, land and housing just doesn't work. Poor people can't afford these market prices. We got to pull it off the market. And Neil just kept smiling at me. He said, read that book, and then you come back and you talk to me about that book. So for not going on and on and on, I'll just say it was the beginning of a relationship, but it was a relationship that there was shared learning, and as Neil called it, learning is reciprocal, right? The community comes into the academy goes out into the community, and that cycle continues, and it needs to be replicated or continue those particular relationships. Fast forward a couple of years later, after these relationships are developing with people like Peter Marcuse and others, and we do an action with Picture the Homeless in New York City. We took over a building on 116th Street and Madison Avenue in East Harlem, and it was the first time anybody had ever taken over any property in New York City in a number of years. And professors started popping up at this action. One of them was Mark Nason, who was a professor of African American Studies at Fordham University, and he said, this is really interesting what you all are doing. I want you to read this book. They were doing stuff like this in the 30s. I want you to read this book. And I'm like, shit, these guys keep giving me these books to read, right? And they want to talk about it. But it was interesting. Some of the things that we were doing he was comparing to history, which I didn't know this history. So it was an opportunity to interact with academia. And it realizes, like, you could have ideas about how we got to where we are, how you make social change. I like to call myself a practitioner of direct action and civil disobedience. But Neil would always say to me as I walked through the halls of the Graduate Center, Rob, you and Max at Take Back the Land always talk about nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. I want you to know the revolution can be violent. Just think about it. He'd just keep on walking, right? He'd plant these seeds and making you think and constantly opening up. But what it did is brought me back to him to say, okay, what do you think about these tactics that we're using to reclaim property? Does it make sense? And these dialogues opened up, and you saw these interactions. I'll suffice to say that there are other professors in this room that I've been in conferences with that are thinking about it, and I do believe there is such thing as scholar activists, right? There is a group called the NOSA, the International Network of Scholar Activists. I work with people like Manisha Desai and Jackie Smith, and these are folks that are working with grassroots organizations and helping to develop these ideas and theories that folks are coming for all of us, whether you're documented or undocumented. Participation, we should have the right to participate in those decisions that are going to affect our lives, and it should bring equity for all of us, right? If we organize around a set of values and principles, it changes severely how we do our work, and I think it brings us closer together. So I'll stop there. I hope that was a rather long way of answering your question, but I hope I answered it.
That's great. So I'm going to go to Gretchen next, and Gretchen and I go way back to grad school. We sort of got to know each other working on a study of how incredibly badly treated the workers were at UC Berkeley. And then, you know, our workers come together and, yeah, it was a lifetime ago in all sorts of ways since then. So Gretchen is fantastic at bringing together issues of housing and homelessness with labor. And, you know, so for example, she describes how homeless and other homeless insecure folks actually, you know, through being day laborers, kind of get forced to evict other people who are on the edge of housing. And so, I mean, that's just one example, but I was wondering if you could talk us through a few of these ways that you see these connections between labor and housing issues.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Teresa, for organizing this conference. I love these kinds of conferences, and I'm really excited to learn from people. Can you hear me? Yeah, more or less? Okay. I want to just kind of start by saying and admitting to you that I am deeply grappling with this question about the intersections between housing, homelessness, and labor politics, because in my capacity as an activist and as someone who's largely running an organization, I can just tell you right now that I don't have this quite figured out, but I'll just say that I'm working with an organization that organizes undocumented immigrant dairy farm workers in upstate New York. And this is like a big collaborative project between the Worker Center of Central New York and the Worker Justice Center of New York. And what we're encountering is that every single time we have any kind of impact on a particular farm, or that the workers start organizing, is that they're getting fired. And this was actually the basis of a lawsuit that was brought against the state of New York. The governor, Cuomo, decided he wasn't going to defend the lawsuit, but it ended up getting overturned anyway because of the New York Farm Bureau. But the point is that when these workers are fired, they're also evicted. So they're losing housing, and now the organization is faced with this huge, very contentious issue around what they're going to do with respect to the commitment to organizing workers and then the provision of housing for homeless undocumented people. So I'm really grappling with it, I'm really struggling with it, and I just wanted to say that because it's really dominated my entire week. But I'm actually here to talk about more of my scholarship and try to talk about kind of how these issues and the intertwined nature of housing precarity and labor precarity, how I try to address them and what implications I think they have for activism today. So I'm just going to talk to you about a few different projects, and I'm going to start with talking about day labor. If you know anything about homelessness, you probably know that day labor is a very, very dominant income generating strategy for precariously housed and homeless individuals. So, you know, it's really one of the clearest cases where you see this inextricable link between labor precarity and housing precarity. So in particular, much of my research has been focused on day labor agencies, so formal day labor agencies that are really considered employers of last resort for employees of last resort, and that operate kind of as a dumping ground for the discards or the superfluous members of our society. And what these companies do is that they kind of organize these populations into a just-in-time reserve army of labor and then process them into cheap and hyper-disposable workers to carry out the most degraded, dangerous, and degrading jobs at the very bottom of the labor market. So in an effort to drum up bodies, and that's explicitly how these companies talk about it, they talk about drumming up bodies, right? Like just recruiting bodies to fill a reserve army of labor. They deliberately recruit the homeless. And much of my work has looked at the ways in which they partner with homeless shelters to offer the clients of the shelters the, quote, opportunity for employment. So I try to really argue that we have to situate these for-profit actors, right, these actual employers at the bottom of the labor market in our understanding of the way in which neoliberal poverty governance works and, you know, this urban landscape of poverty governance. And that we have to try to highlight the circulation and the collaboration between for-profit actors like day labor agencies and the shelter industry. So in particular, I talk about how day labor agencies apply this kind of parasitic and profitable trade in brokered bodies, whereas the workers that I worked alongside repeatedly would talk about it, the poor and the pimped. But they always are doing so by marketing themselves as a service to the poor, right? So they're always masking the exploitation by actually adopting the same sort of rhetoric and social service do-goodership of the agencies with which they're partnering. So they actually use the homeless shelters and other social service providers to try to justify the exploitation that they're involved in. So as they do so, what I've tried to really try to highlight is the way in which they promote and perpetuate the responsibilization of the poor and the resacralization of work, right? Making work sacred, the moralization of work, right? They're huge proponents of this. They argue that we give you the opportunity to work and that work is going to change your life, right? That work is what's going to change your conditions. And as they do so, of course, they're obscuring the role that they themselves play in normalizing conditions of profoundly extreme precarity in the labor market, of lowering labor standards, and of reproducing workers' poverty and homelessness. I would venture to say that there's not been a single homeless day laborer who's ever, on the basis of the day labor jobs that they're getting, gotten out of homelessness. It's just not possible. So more to the point, I want to try to talk about what this opportunity means. Okay, so at first I just wanted to lay out why I think day labor agencies are central to understanding and bringing down homelessness. But now I want to talk about the work itself. So what is the opportunity that they're providing the poorest members of our society? Well, I did much of my research in the city of Baltimore. And Baltimore, as you probably know, is a city facing an extreme housing crisis, as we see everywhere. But Baltimore is a city where there's over 7,000 evictions that take place every single year. In fact, just this week, the Baltimore Sun released an extraordinary, in-depth investigative report on the housing board in Baltimore, which I myself studied as well, and it's a really phenomenal report, so I encourage you guys to read it. But the point is that day labor agencies, one of the most frequent jobs that they provide to workers is to work on eviction crews. So the opportunity that they're providing to the homeless is to make other people homeless, quite literally. And what I found by actually working as a day laborer and being present at over a dozen evictions is that every single one of them plays out, right? Even though there are housing activists, but you have 7,000 evictions taking place, right, each year. Every single one of these evictions played out as a class struggle between and amongst the poor. Like the literal way in which it took place was the actual eviction, was a class struggle between the poor. It was homeless workers who have this opportunity to work, and not just an opportunity to work, but an opportunity to loot, take all the belongings from the people who are being evicted as well, in contention with the people that they are throwing out. And so what I want to say about this is that I think a really key thing that we need to be considerate of as housing activists is this kind of displacement of the class struggle from against, the class struggle between landlords, property managers, and tenants to this kind of horizontal class struggle between and amongst the poor. And I think we need to make that apparent, and we need to try to find a way to intervene in that. And I want to just say one last thing about kind of where my work is currently. What I'm looking at now is this continued focus on the processing of labor. So how is it that people are being processed into laborers outside of the realm of the workplace? And what is the kind of dominant strategy for managing the poor in society today? And I would say that what we've seen in the post-welfare period is this turn towards workforce development defined not the way that, I forgot your name back there, who runs the center. Not the way you talked about it, okay? Not the job creation strategy, but workforce development in the sense of job readiness. What you see now is job readiness has dominated social service provision to the poor. It's not just a matter of welfare to work, but you see it in all kinds of agencies, all kinds of institutions. Teresa and I were just talking about this. But I'm in the midst of doing a collaborative project with Brian Hennigan, who was supposed to be here, but he's not here because his flight is delayed. And we're studying the kind of ideological training process that's going on in these job readiness programs for the homeless, for the precariously housed, in 4 different organizations. And I truly think that this is an extraordinarily important topic for people who are concerned with labor politics. Because what's happening in these programs, and so I studied it, for instance, in a rescue mission, which is the dominant homeless service provider in Syracuse, which is one of the poorest cities in the country. And this program was actually, it was a mandatory program that the clients of the mission had to go through. So it's the anchor of the workforce readiness, the workforce development vision of the organization. It's the only thing that they offer was this particular program. And it's mandatory that the residents in the shelter attend this. And I'm not going to get into the details of it, but the point is that all of the programs, right, all the different agencies where we studied them, are involved in this kind of moral transformation of the poor, and a very heavy-handed moral transformation of the poor and valorization of work that's going on irrespective of whether or not the clients actually get work. But there's a huge training process going on to try to condition the poorest people in our society to embrace the lowest, most degraded forms of employment that exist. And that's the purpose of these programs, I would argue. The purpose of the programs is not actually to get them jobs, but to get them prepared for the types of jobs that if they're lucky enough to get them, they will find themselves within. And so that's kind of where my work has gone now, and again, I think it's very intimately connected to this question of housing, homelessness, and labor politics. And I look forward to talking with you guys more, so thank you.
Thanks, Gretchen, and I'm so excited that you're going to stay with me and we're going to get to talk about this stuff all night, although you said you don't want to do that. And I'm so glad that so many of you are like staying together and you're going to get to have these good conversations. Because, you know, this thing is supposed to be all about dialogue. So onwards. Craig. So Craig, actually, I don't really know how to say your name, please. It was also an activist. And you know, he's got kind of a really different angle from Gretchen in that he's kind of looking at how housing and, you know, homelessness services are both kind of trying to save people from death, but also, you know, holding them in a place of sickness and degradation. And so, I mean, basically what he's doing is bringing some exciting new ways of thinking about what many of us are used to thinking about as poverty camps. I think you just right? You know, so he's theorizing, you know, the homelessness industry and the way it's changed with homelessness, with Housing First in particular. And looking at the way that homelessness and the suffering of homeless folks actually becomes a real source of profit within neoliberalism. So, over to you.
Thank you. And again, thank you so much for all the work bringing us together and letting me be part of this conversation. Let me just put my timer on. Okay, so I thought I would start with saying three sort of goals I had with that project, with my book, in terms of thinking about housing as a system that gives life and takes life. And then off of those three things, so I might talk about 3 goals and then 3 implications for those goals for how we think about housing activism. So, you know, the first goal in that framing is really to shift in social science to a structural analysis and away from a discourse of individuals and the problems with individuals, or even now kind of populations and the problems with managing populations. And what I really wanted to emphasize is that, you know, so most social science and social services, sort of mainstream social science and social services, approach homelessness as a problem, but I want us to be thinking about it as an effect, actually. It's an effect of the interaction of a whole complex of systems, including private property systems, housing law, labor, social welfare policy, healthcare, education. So all these systems work together to produce some people as vulnerable to living without housing. And you know, we can talk more about this later, but you know, we can kind of group these things together. One way is thinking about them as parts of or aspects of racial capitalism. And so another thing I'm trying to do with this is to point out that it's no accident who experiences housing insecurity or housing precarity in the United States. It's a result of specific forms of racialized subordination. And I really want to produce an idea of that as active. So I use sometimes the term housing deprivation because I'm trying to really stress this idea that housing is being taken from people. And that's to really implicate the state in particular. And so this structural or systemic way of thinking about housing and homelessness is to help us frame homelessness as a form of state violence. So this is one of the first goals. Another goal is to, in thinking about in life and death politics, is just to highlight the stakes. Living without shelter reduces the length of people's lives and drastically harms health. At the same time, living in housing can secure health, and it can build health in many forms. For example, the ways that housing can be a way for building wealth and the kinds of forms of life that wealth gives access to. So in raising the stakes this way, I'm really trying to think in terms of geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism. She defines racism as group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So when we say that housing gives life or takes life, it's doing it in the United States in very particular racialized ways. And one of the ways that then I talk about that is thinking about the production of people living without shelter as a kind of surplus of this housing system. And it's a surplus then that becomes valuable in the ways that Teresa was pointing out. It becomes a problem for foundations to give money to study. It becomes an issue for NGOs and nonprofits to manage. And so in that way, despite a whole sort of media and political discourse about homeless populations as a financial drain, actually it's a site of economic productivity, just the mere existence. Even before people are sort of captured as bodies into these state labor systems, they're sort of seen as a source of value. And then the third sort of goal in thinking about housing again as a technology that takes and gives life is to put homelessness back into systems of housing. And of course, I think to those of us in the room, it should be obvious. But it's funny when you read some of the epidemiological or public health literature on homelessness, it's like there's no discussion of housing at all, right? Because it's all about these people, these individuals, or this population. And so the whole context of housing is evacuated. And what this does is it serves to sort of normalize homelessness as if it's inevitable, as if it's given, and if it isn't, as if it's something that we can't understand, again, by looking at those structural or systemic forces. And one of the effects of, one of the ways that I've seen this described that I really love, that I picked up on my book, is this sort of group of anarchist writers have a book called The Housing Monster. And so that's their term for this system. And I think it's a nice, effective image. And so one of the effects of the housing monster, the system of housing, is that it pits us against each other in exactly the ways that Gretchen was just pointing to. And often pits us against the wrong people in the sense of not those who are the actual source of housing deprivation or housing insecurity. And so this happens, it also serves to isolate us from each other by creating different kinds of housing and different categories of people who have access to that housing. And so we feel, so that people who are buying homes feel like their needs and the well-being of their housing is at odds with the needs of people living on the street for a new shelter or something like this. It puts it pits renters against each other in a very competitive market. And so, but putting it back into one system, I want us to see those links and to see that we all have a stake in challenging housing insecurity and housing deprivation, and that in this way, homelessness is a very particular expression of the system, but it's not exceptional. And most of the, again, sort of mainstream social science and social service discourse exceptionalizes homelessness. And it becomes like this kind of inscrutable problem of this special category of person. But in fact, it's just one expression of a system that we're all implicated in. And so with those three things in mind, I want to think about three implications for this way of thinking about homelessness. And I'll kind of move backwards in the ones I just did. So starting with this last one about thinking about the system that we're all a part of, it means we want to take approaches in organizing activism that work at those links, that organize across categories of housing and across the populations targeted by these different forms of housing. And that, for me, is one of the reasons why this gathering is so exciting, because we're really sort of defying what, in many ways, is a kind of a social service logic that all these different kinds of housing involve different kinds of people, and all those different kinds of people require different kinds of specialized expertise. And it doesn't mean that we all have the same experience, of course, but that we have stakes in each other's experiences of housing. And so one of the things that I've been involved in the last few years I was really excited about in Washington, D.C. was a housing campaign called Housing for All that was organized by the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development. And so it was a campaign that was working to get sort of city money moved into all these different kinds of housing. So it started from emergency shelters, went through other levels of supportive housing to programs for renters, programs for tenants to buy buildings and turn them into co-ops. So it moved across all these kind of levels of housing and types of housing that are usually isolated from each other, and then the people living in them are isolated from each other as well. And then another sort of way that we can think about how this impacts our approaches to activism and organizing is for us to then ask the question of how do we secure life, and how do we protect people's well-being, and how do we guarantee health. I think this a good like counterexample, like what I think we shouldn't be moving towards, although I understand why we need these things sometimes. But I write in the book about the use of the vulnerability index, and now it's been moved to this whole other level since the time that book was written. And HUD has developed this tool that's supposed to measure people's likelihood to die and help calculate that in terms of like the priorities for giving people access to shelter. And so for me, the problem with something like the vulnerability index is it's measuring the effects of these systems that destroy people's health and takes people's lives away, but it's not intervening in the production of that in the first place. Of course we need, people need housing, people need services, and so we want to think about that in a politicized way. And how can we think about social services as embedded within, and by that I mean really broadly, like the things we do to help people live, things we do to protect people's well-being, how do we embed that within social movement frames? And one thing that means is that we need to take approaches to housing that start with the most precarious and the most vulnerable, and we need to develop strategies for securing housing for those populations, knowing that if we can meet those needs, we can meet everybody's needs. And here I'm borrowing from my friend and often collaborator, Dean Spade, who likes to say that social justice doesn't trickle down, right? And there's often this idea that will come back for you later, but that's not how this works. And so we want to prioritize people who are most vulnerable. So this means, in the kind of context that we're thinking, active drug users, people with psychiatric disabilities, people who are undocumented, youth, children, people who are usually left behind, again, by the social service model. And then the last thing that this sort of reframing, I think, asks us to think about in terms of approaches to activism organizing is, what other systems or structures do we want to build? And for me, this really centers the question of the state and where we should think about how we interact with the state, what kinds of demands we want to make of the state, what we can rely on the state for and what we don't want to rely on the state for. And here I've been really influenced by, I was talking about it with Aaron earlier, the work of Adam Geary, who has a great book about anti-Black racism and HIV/AIDS in the United States. And Geary develops this concept of state intimacy in that book. And the thing that he argues that I think is so important for us is that the public health discourse has really focused, when looking at disproportionate rates of HIV and AIDS among young Black men in particular, it's really focused on like the problem of like individual choices and behavior and how to intervene in that. So it's very parallel to exactly the kind of stuff we see in homeless social service discourse. And what Geary says is that what actually determines vulnerability around HIV and AIDS is how intimately and directly the state intervenes in your life. And so what he says is that he refers to this as the violent intimacy of the racist state. And so what he really looks at is processes of ghettoization and mass incarceration as the most sort of invasive, intimate forms of state violence that then overexpose. For me, and all this means is what the question means, like if we know this about the state, and if we know that the state is always a violent apparatus, and often even when it's giving us something or helping us, it's doing so in a violent form. What does that mean about how we want to think about the state and how we want to approach the state for the things we need to live and to be housed?
Okay, so over to Nikita. As Eric said, Nikita's organization, Picture the Homeless, is unusual in some respects in really understanding homeless folks as intellectuals already. So not so much seeing this scholar-activist divide. As intellectuals and experts on the housing issues of New York City. And so, for example, in terms of civil rights, Picture the Homeless has brought together homeless folks to draft and produce legislation making housing protected status in policing encounters. So we really love you to reflect about how you incorporate the knowledge coming from the experience of Picture the Homeless members into your housing organization.
Thank you so much. Good evening, family. Good evening, family. Good evening. All right. First of all, I'd like to thank the university, and in particular Eric, who is a friend of mine, an academic who gets it. And oftentimes you don't find that. And that's important because the work that you do helps to drive what we do. In homeless people's encounter with the issues of housing, it's layered. It's layered. It doesn't just start with a person that's 37 years old or 40 years old. In many cases, it starts well before that, even generations before that. It started with the targeting of certain populations in this country, in particular black and brown folk, people that are different. So in order to peel away at these layers, you have to look at everything that contributes to what a certain population is going through. And for homeless folk, it's not only not being housed, it's being systemically targeted by various groups, not only law enforcement, bureaucracy, families, neighbors, you name it. We're fending off a lot. Organizing these folks is really no different than organizing any other group, but totally different. If I have to be in a shelter as a single mother with a very limited education and raise 2 children, it's hard. It's hard for me to navigate the system. It can be done, but it's hard. If I'm on the street, unfortunately, with because I just lost my job and lost my housing because of economics, it's hard. All of these things come into place when you are trying to get a particular group that has many issues that they're dealing with, and they all have to be addressed. So a lot of people have to be held accountable. A lot of people have to be held accountable. And one of the things that I think that Picture Homeless does very, very well is we will hold your ass accountable, no matter who you are. So if you're an elected official and you're allowing a shelter agency to spend $1.8 billion to keep people in the shelter, over 60,000 people in the shelter, we're gonna call your shit out. If you are a mayor who is allowing the police commissioner to target homeless people because of their housing status, we're gonna call you out, we're gonna sue you. If you're a landlord or a shelter provider and you're providing unsanitary, unsafe conditions, we're gonna call you out. And who better to do that than the folks that are immediately affected? And I think that's what Picture Homeless does better than anybody I know or any other homeless organization I know. How do you take that a step further? Rob Robinson's a perfect example. He does. You wouldn't think that she was homeless, but Rob said he came from a middle income background. There are so many homeless people that have acquired the things that you would think that you would need in a capitalistic society. One of the biggest problems of homelessness is driven by economics in this country. The unfortunate thing about New York, opposed to a lot of other places, is it's stereotypical in the look of the homeless. black and brown people. But here in Minneapolis, I only saw one homeless person today, and they weren't black or brown. And when you go to Denver, it's a different look. Some of your other metropolitan areas, it's a different look. But one thing that is constant is the freaking targeting of you because of your status. The targeting of you because of your status. The particularly targeting of you because of your status. One, if you're black or brown, your skin. Two, your housing status or lack thereof housing. You're in the way. What we're seeing now, since I've come to picture the homeless, what I've noticed is that it has been broadened in the last 15, 20 years, where now you see municipalities enacting ordinances, local ordinances targeting us to take you talk about taking back the land, they're taking back the land. And in order to do so, you don't have the right to rest. You can't erect a structure. You can't legally ask for money unless you work for the Salvation Army around Christmas time and ring a freaking bell. All of these things are compounded to make you disillusioned and go away. And what we do is we say, no, you don't have to go away. What is the issue? What is the issue? The issue is housing. 10 years ago we started, over 10 years ago, we started a campaign. We're looking in New York, we're looking at all of these buildings that have been abandoned and warehoused for 20 and 30 years. And then when we were asking, how much of this property is owned by private developers, how much is owned by the city, nobody knew. We ran upon an elected official and we counted, homeless people counted in the borough of Manhattan, every abandoned building and vacant lot. Homeless people did that. Move forward. It used to be, whereas one of the main sources of income for homeless people, or street homeless folk, and not only street homeless folk, but now we see it's a lot of other folks, is collecting recyclables. And it used to, you could not go into a store, a homeless person, with all your bags and collect the monies that was earned legally. And what did homeless people do? We found out who all of these stores were. We contacted our then Attorney General and told him that these folks were targeting us because of our housing status. This led to an edict coming from the Attorney General saying, if they have bottles, you must redeem them, and if not, you'll be fined. Which then brought about recycling machines. Picture the Homeless did that. We're able to go visit our loved ones on Hart Island, which is a potter's field. We organize homeless people to sit down with the Commissioner of Corrections and get homeless people to go visit their loved ones, including one of our co-founders. We have since organized homeless people to incorporate housing status as a protected status in New York City. And when you violate that Community Safety Act, we then will take you to the New York City Human Rights Commission. And so we have a claim now before the New York City Human Rights Commission where homeless people are being targeted and told to move along simply because they're street homeless. These are the things that homeless people do. These are the things that push back against who homeless people are, what we don't do. That makes us no different than anybody else, but it makes us extremely different than everybody else. Thank you.
everyone. I'm hoping that we can open it up. My own feeling is that often when someone asks a question and then kind of like the whole panel answers it, it sort of stops there being enough dialogue. So I kind of would like you to address your questions to specific folks. Yeah, okay. First to you, ma'am.
My name is Sherry. My name is Sherry Makeda with the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Panel. My question is this. How much analysis in your work is done on the nonprofit industrial complex and the progressive foundations that lead to the social control for homeless people as it relates to your organizing work? I know that's a big, loaded question, but nowadays, since I've been in this work for 30 years, the first thing I do is say, hi, what's your name, and who gives you money?
Sorry? I think it's great.
I can speak to that. This is part of exactly what I was talking about when I said that I'm trying to look at the ways that creating people living without shelter has actually been a site of economic productivity. So, the nonprofit industrial complex has, there's a whole, one of the things that really spurred me when I first started doing this research was looking at how both over, 20-year period, the size of the population.
You're homeless, whether you're in shelter or on the street, the services that are supposedly there don't go far enough. Or depending upon the administration will depend upon whether or not those services will continue and to what end they will continue to help you to move out of your situation. So you're absolutely right. You can't just say homeless people need this and don't give that to them. There are a lot of things that we do need, and now what are we talking about? And there are all these catchphrases, and now it's opioids, and that's being generated on another end by people that are flooding the system with these opioids that keep us down. So, well, I have to go back to we have to expose these various groups for what they're doing to us. And if you don't expose them, then you're not going to get the things that you're looking for in order to change your situation.
So thanks very much, Gary, for organizing this. I'm just struck by the timing. So 170 years ago, two famous guys got together, infamous, and they published probably one of the most important pamphlets. One studying the working class in Manchester, the other trying to understand the logics of what was going on. I think there might be a time right now where these conversations come together. So what are we saying about how capitalism works at this point in time? Are there any insights? I mean, these are monsters. They move, they shift. And again, I think the inspirational ideas of course, stand up and fight like this. But how do we sharpen our ideas? And I think Nikita's destiny is overwhelmingly powerful. Hopefully through the conference, we'll try to tie that together. One of the ideas, and this is the question, is in South Africa where I work, this revolutionary idea that poor people can think was actually very groundbreaking. And some of us started to take it seriously, and the insights that it was gained through this is actually quite profound. So I was trying to think through, as we talked about, what are some of the ideas that are coming about what he's seeing, about what people in academia are not seeing.
So Ken, I'll just say first, I just had the pleasure of seeing Brian again from South Africa. He was in New York for a day, and we had breakfast last Friday, and we talked about this over breakfast, right? We can't just talk about life in general. We had to have a serious conversation over a bagel and coffee. And I think Brian was struck because he went down to Jackson, Mississippi. He was here on a fellowship, and he got to see Cooperation Jackson and understand what they were trying to accomplish there. And the first thing is we talk about Cooperation Jackson in our communities is that it's about a new economic model. That's part of it, but what it's really about is building power in a different model, in a different way of living for people that have been marginalized from as far back as we can all remember, right? And Kali Akuno, who leads that group, is very clear about that, right? He was in New York recently, and there's this big debate going on about the cooperative movement in New York, and Kali had to stop everybody and say, this is not about building cooperatives, right? I wish people would understand that this is about building economic power and building power, political power within our own communities. So it's a different way of thinking. We understand what capitalism has done for us, right? For me, when you start to talk about capitalism and Marxism, people sometimes say that's too academic and push back. As a homeless person, for me, David Harvey simplified it very easily for me by saying a house has a use value and an exchange value. And that formula can be manipulated by all the powers except UROC, and that was fundamentally grounding for me. So a lot of it is about political education, which we don't do enough of here. And I just wish we would get grounded in that. I'm going next week to Brazil. There's a young lady in here from Brazil, Laura DeVita, a good student I had the pleasure of mentoring at the New School. She's out of Berkeley now. But that's where a lot of that is happening. Places like South Africa, as you mentioned, in Brazil, some of these other countries, where we're learning, right, that you have to build power by showing people who are marginalized and disenfranchised for years are realizing how they can build their own power, but they're doing a lot of that through political education. And that's learning, that's reading, and that's coming into the ivory tower, not being offended by the ivory tower and saying, okay, I need to learn that, explain it. Tell me what Gramsci, tell me what Marx, and tell me what these folks were talking about. I want to understand that. Brazil really grounds you in the understanding of a worker in the role of society, man, and it just changes everything for you. It has changed me politically by getting that understanding in Brazil.
Thanks. So next up, Sarcilo. Yeah.
My question is for Gretchen, particularly. During your research and your studies and with concerning day labor and the homeless community, what have your findings been with transgender and homeless trans people, and not just trans people, but the entire LGBT community?
In my experience, I didn't encounter out trans or LGBT members, so that I don't have any experience with that particularly. But can I just say one other thing? I just want to say something about the political education, because that was, I ran out of time, but that was what I was getting at the end of my, of what I was saying, which is that I actually think there's a profound need for immense and very intense forms of political education amongst the poorest in our society, because they're getting it, but they're getting it from a whole other crew, right, of nonprofits, evangelical, groups, and this nonprofits that are really just doing the work of the state, right, because of the devolved state. So they're getting, and that's what the job readiness research that we've been doing is looking at, is like, what is the education that they are subjected to, left and right, like all across the board. Many of the people that are in our study have gone to like 10 of these different programs, so they're just kind of cycling through them as a condition of receiving the services that they're getting. And it is a form of education, and it's a form of kind of transformation, but it's exactly this that I think and I think there's an opportunity for this. I don't know how to execute it, but I think that's what I wanted to say.
Well, we're seeing it at the roots, the seeds are planted in Jackson. We're all focusing on Jackson right now. It's an important.
Craig, did you?
I just wanted to address the Homeless is coalition with over 35 groups, And there are groups that do deal with issues of sexual identity, transgender. And I think in our coalition work, it helps us to the point of understanding other folks that are suffering along with us. And that's why the support that we've gotten from folks in the Anti-Violence Project and other groups that deal with gender issues is helping us along the way, though there is a lot of work to be done. We're presently at Prisoner Homes working on some implicit bias avenues, which I think is very important for all groups that are interested in coming together. This is a big fight for all of us. And a lot of this stuff is ingrained in us as a particular group. But if one's catching it, we're all catching it. And I think that's going to help our coalition work go that much farther. So I think, you know, the trans community has just as much voice as anybody else, and in our coalition work, we help to uplift that voice.
Yeah, I asked because I'm from Denver, Homeless Out Loud, and Colorado Village Collaborative, and we, ever since I was homeless myself in Denver, I have been doing a lot of homeless outreach and activism work. I've met an incredible group of friends and people that I call my family. And like Ibrahim, I just met him for the first time last year, and finally when we got our village, the Loving Community Village, through Colorado Village Collaborative, and we had an opportunity to pick his brain, and we did. And so, and thank you for organizing this incredible conference and having all of us here. It's an honor to be here.
And we are pumped. Okay, thank you, Sister Lo. I see a hand over there, and then
So my name is Sean Webster. I'm from Minneapolis, and specifically North Minneapolis. I wanted to speak to just briefly, because I think that Jackson does get brought up a lot, and I think importantly that Jackson gets brought up a lot, but I don't often hear a lot of nuance brought to the history of the work going on in Jackson. One that I think a lot of folks, specifically that either haven't been there or haven't spent significant time studying Jackson, consider that have happened overnight, you know. But also that Cooperation Jackson isn't the only group organized. That Cooperation Jackson plays an important role, but that there are other entities organizing within Jackson, Mississippi, and that there was a split within the Malcolm X grassroots movement after Chokwe Movement passed, you know, and so all that to bring, I don't know, just like the is I think what I'm getting at.
So I think it's a difficult process, right? And I think we have to step up. I know for me, coming from an African-American family, buying a narrative, I talk about being homeless, transforming me. I saw the world a certain way before I laid on those streets in Miami for 2 years, and then I had to unlearn a lot of what I was taught. But I realized I had to step up. Nobody's going to do it for me. I got to change. So there's a lot of individualism within people who are suffering, even poor people and disenfranchised, that think only about me. We have to come together as communities if we want to make real change. There are political formations here in this country, and I attribute those only two places, in my opinion, that political education is happening to the degree that it is happening in those international spaces that are taught. It's left roots, which is disenfranchised people from the West Coast, that is starting to teach and spread out around the country in Jackson, Mississippi. There is a lot going on in Detroit, but Detroit is struggling just keeping people alive, right? So for me, a lot of the history I gained is that direct line from the South to Detroit and that back and forth, right? So Michigan welfare rights are my folks. These are my peeps, right? That's why I'm involved in a water struggle right now, because we have to, and one thing I want to say to the table here, I think we sort of blur the line between services and needs, right? I don't need somebody to serve me water. I'm a human being, I need water to survive, right? So that's where human rights comes in, and we should think differently, right? You're not gonna bring me a bottle of water and fix my problem. What you're gonna do is allow me to reach into the river and take as much water as I want because I'm a human being and I need to leave. So I think a lot is within us. We have to change as individuals. And I think the electoral process, I can't stand electoral politics. Anybody from New York knows me, keeps telling me you should get involved, get lawyers. I'm not going in that box, right? But I do believe we need to make political links, because if you want to undo a system, you have to infiltrate it and bring it down. And that's exactly what they've done in Jackson, Mississippi. It starts small and then it grows out horizontally. It's not going to trickle down, it has to grow out horizontally.
So I think we've got time for one more question. You don't need to be a big shot, but like, just in case you're wondering. Okay.
So I would like to ask Nikita and Rob, what kind of advice would you give to academics that want to partner and support homeless folks?
Take direction, understand that these folks have lived experiences, that they have an experience, they have knowledge that needs to be shared, and those experiences can do as much teaching as your degree can do. This is something Neil told me. Neil said to me when he brought me to that CUNY Grad Center, Rob, they're going to learn more from you, or just as much from you as they're going to learn from me, even though I got the document. Doesn't make you any less of a thinker than I am, right? So people who have power need to exert that power, and homeless people have power, right? They have a brain in it. All of us have a brain. It's how we use it and what we use it for, right? So I'll say this also, and I'll say this in closing. When we talk about academics, I don't know who in this room knows Stanley Aronowitz, distinguished professor of sociology at the CUNY Grad Center. Never got a PhD. Never got a PhD. Never got a master's degree. But he's a distinguished professor of sociology at the CUNY Grad Center in New York. Right? So the piece of paper don't mean shit, it's what you got in here.
I would like to also mention that in my time of knowing Eric, that Keep Homeless has established itself over the almost 19 years of being the go-to organization dealing with homelessness. And in our years of bringing the homeless voice to the forefront, our history precedes us. We get calls all the time. I mean, right up until the day I left New York from grad students wanting to come back. What's up with Picture the Homeless? And, you know, they know about us. So we get people, we deal with a group of Germans that come to us every year. I mean, folks know about our work because we get it done. And I think that's very, very important. And these young people, even now to the point where it's in the turmoil of civil rights, I just moderated a panel on Black Lives Matter, and I was really surprised as to why I would be asked to do so. But it's because of a lot of the work that I gained through Picture the Homeless, of knowing that homeless people, a lot of them have bestowed their knowledge upon young academics, upon movements, and it's starting to come to fruition now. The knowledge that we have, and I think that's why academia is reaching out to us now a lot more so than they have in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to add one thing here. It seems to me that when I look at liberal organizations that partner, sort of those who want to help, who are of a higher class background and poor folks, that often the role of the poor folks there is to give testimonies about individual suffering, and then to kind of clear the stage for the framing. And like what's really important that's come out of this conversation, I think, is that yes, stories are a fantastic vehicle, but it's like we got to listen to like the kind of way, the way of thinking that's coming up from the grassroots, and not just be like, oh, here's a poster child for something, us intellectuals want to argue, right? Okay, make it real quick.
Okay. I just really want to, as an elder, I just really want to encourage people, if you don't know the history of homeless organizing in the U.S., I think it's a rich history, and that, there needs to be, some more writing around that, because I think that there's lots of lessons to learn. And like the brother was raising about, some of the amazing organizing work that's happening in Jackson. I can tell you right now, there's amazing organizing work that's happening all over the country. It's just that they don't have a particular foundation funding them, so nobody knows about their work. So if anybody's interested in knowing about some of that organizing work, I'm here. My own oral history, hello. We organized the first housing takeovers ever. And people will see it. We brought the photo exhibits of here. This is my niece here. They're part of the Minnesota Five, who took on the first foreclosure sit-ins in Minnesota here. So there's great history. Let's not divorce ourselves from it.
The lady that just mentioned asked us a question. Lynn Lewis, our former director, executive director at Picture the Homeless, is now, she left to do the oral history project of Picture the Homeless. So it's coming. She's working on it. So look for it.
So thank you all so much. Let's give this plenary an amazing hand. So this is it, right? This is what happens, because I talk to Picture the Homeless all the time. We know each other real well. Picture the Homeless might talk to Denver Homeless Out Loud all the time. We might talk to RAP all the time. Teresa and I talk to each other all the time. She's on my committee. It's great, right? We all have our avenues where we're connected, but this gathering is a chance to expand those, right? It's a chance to talk to people who we might not otherwise encounter, even though I think we're all probably working on pretty similar stuff, and it's really important. So we hope that this is going to be a really exciting space for this kind of cross-pollination that was started with this conversation. So I'm just going to wrap up with a quick logistical note. So tomorrow morning, we are going to get started. We're going to have breakfast available from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. That's going to be in Blagan Hall, room 425. All this information is in your program, so make sure you have one. Then we're going to have concurrent sessions throughout the morning. We're going to have a lunchtime plenary session focused on criminalization, and then one more set of sessions in the afternoon, followed by a performance by Zamia, which is a homeless-led theater organization here in Minneapolis. They're pretty awesome. And then finally, we're going to head over to the Nomad Bar and Grill for a little relaxation and pizza, and a surprise musical performance. So you got to make sure to stick around for that. All right, thank you all so much, and we'll see you tomorrow.